So anyone who knows me knows that I'm really into movies. And in my post-grad job hunt, I've had a lot of time to see a lot of movies and talk about a lot of movies, and I think the people closest to me are probably a little tired of it, so I decided to channel that into these videos. I'm just going to be giving some brief reviews of the new releases that I saw each week, and recommending them or not recommending them. So enjoy this first episode, and if you choose to take my recommendations, then please get in touch, especially for this one. The first thing I saw was The Eyes of Tammy Faye. This is a new biopic about Tammy Faye Baker and Jim Baker, who were a husband and wife televangelist team who conned a ton of people out of their money by asking them to pledge to their organization and then embezzling the money and using it to make themselves filthy stinkin' rich. All of these scandals involving the Bakers and Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell, all of whom are present in the film, were pretty before my time, so I'm not terribly knowledgeable about it. And while the trailers didn't do much for me, I have to say that I was really interested in this film simply because stories like this involving religious leaders really fascinate me. And on top of that, Tammy Faye became kind of an unlikely ally to the gay community despite aligning herself with people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. Unfortunately, though, this is possibly the most Oscar-baity movie I have ever seen, or at least since Green Book. The movie actually begins with a news montage, and there are several more throughout the film to showcase that important plot developments are happening. It's a true story with recognizable actors made unrecognizable through prosthetic makeup, and it's just so cheesy. I guess the best thing I can say for it is that I found it more watchable than movies like Vice or Green Book, but I do have to say that the parts of the film I found most entertaining were the ones in which I found ironic enjoyment. The first 20 or so minutes and the finale of the film are pretty ridiculous and honestly feel like they could be a parody of this type of movie rather than just being that type of movie. There's a scene towards the beginning where Jim Baker and Tammy Faye are having their first date and there's this sappy music playing, and Jim Baker tells her the story of the time he hit a child with his car, and it's meant to be really emotional, but it honestly almost feels like an SNL skit. One of Andrew Garfield's lines during this scene was so funny and delivered so poorly that I laughed out loud in the theater. And while this kind of corniness is something that I just come to expect from a movie like this is not the only scene where it's an issue. There are so many instances where the audience was kind of chuckling at lines that were clearly supposed to have a lot of emotional impact. The obligatory third act confrontation in which Jim and Tammy discuss all of their grievances with each other, or rather scream them at each other, was met with a lot of laughter from the audience, myself included. Really the only emotional beats that I would say kind of work involve Tammy's relationship with her mother, and that's pretty indicative of everything that this movie does marginally well. At its best, it's just competent, but nothing we've never seen before, and every time I go into a biopic like this, I just hope that there's gonna be something that's presented in a creative or interesting way, but that's really not the case here. It is presented in the most conventional and cliched way it could have possibly been, so it's sure to work for a lot of people because it's a tried and tested formula, and it's definitely gonna win Oscars, but it's just so uninteresting as an artistic expression. But who cares if this movie is artistically interesting, because everyone and their mother knows it's just a vehicle to get Jessica Chastain and Andrew Garfield Oscar nominations, and honestly, their performances are pretty entertaining. Jessica Chastain is a lot of fun to watch and clearly spent a lot of time watching footage of Tammy Faye and getting the mannerisms just right, and at times she does kind of do a good job of portraying the humanity underneath, but at their worst, the central performances feel like Rami Malek in Bohemian Rhapsody, where it felt like a really good impersonator rather than somebody actually playing the real character. The makeup effects are also, unfortunately, a little inconsistent. There are quite a few scenes where it looks really great, and it's clear that the filmmakers knew that it looked great because there are some pretty extreme close-ups where it actually doesn't look like makeup. But then there's also a really distracting scene towards the end where they're both old and Jessica Chastain has a bunch of wrinkles around her mouth and eyes, but the ones around her eyes look like a different color than the rest of her skin. But The makeup on Andrew Garfield doesn't have any wrinkles at all, and it looks very fake and creepy, and I didn't like it at all. And I don't know, maybe that's just how he looks now, but it was certainly a moment in which I could very clearly tell that both actors had a lot of makeup on. The last thing I want to discuss before moving on from The Eyes of Tammy Faye is something that's a little more personally outrageous to me, and that's just how much the marketing has played up the fact that she was involved with the LGBT community and kind of an ally, but that's hardly in the film at all. This is a 2-hour and 15-minute movie where I can only recall 2 scenes in which she directly addresses the fact that she doesn't hate gay people. Both scenes in which this are addressed are in the trailer, but they are definitely things that could be easily edited out for international markets that don't want to see LGBT content portrayed positively, and that's pretty annoying. The real kicker is that in the Where Are They Now segment at the end, really all it says after the fact that Tammy Faye died in 2007 is that she continued her work with the LGBTQ community, when the only work we saw with that in the film was her interviewing an AIDS patient who is still alive today, actually. But every other mention of it in the film is just, I think we need to love all people, but it doesn't really specifically say gay people, she never mentions trans people, and I'm not saying that you would need to focus on that to make a Tammy Faye biopic. I mean, there is a lot in here that could make a really compelling story. It's just the fact that the movie clearly wants you to think that that's centrally what it's about, but it's just not. And frankly, I don't even think that this movie is about anything at all. It reads more like a checklist of everything that's ever happened in Tammy Faye's life without any real consequence. It briefly touches on her addiction to prescription drugs, which culminates in her overdosing and almost dying, but the only fallout of that is that she goes, "Oh, I didn't know Ativan could be addictive. I'm not a drug addict." And that is the last we ever hear or see of her drug addiction. There's no fallout, there's no recovery, there's no consequence really. Even when the film feels like it's going to end on a resonant and poignant message about regret and living with the consequences of your actions and the actions of your loved ones, it just kind of turns around and gives Tammy an ending that I'm not sure was really earned. And that's about all I have to say about The Eyes of Tammy Faye. I didn't really expect to talk about it this long, but the more I talked, the more I realized there was a lot I had to say about it. I can't in good conscience recommend this movie, but I do acknowledge that it's not really for me, and a lot of people would probably get a lot out of this, especially if you like this formula of Oscar baity biopic movie. If that's your thing, then you will certainly get what you are looking for, and you'll probably have a really great time. But as for me, I thought it was a really, really bland, uninspired film that was all to do with surface, but I guess for a movie about Tammy Faye, that might be kind of fitting. I'm one of those obnoxious people that really likes giving star ratings, so I'm gonna give The Eyes of Tammy Faye 2 stars out of 5. It's not the worst movie I've seen this year, but it's really not that great. The other new release I wanted to talk about today is Titane. This is the second feature film from French director Julia Ducournau, and if you don't recognize that name, then you should probably familiarize yourself with it. Her first film, Raw, made quite an impact, and I was certainly among the people who really loved it. It's a very strange cannibal movie that uses its central premise as a metaphor for awakening female sexuality and the way in which society perceives it as dangerous. Julia Ducournau's name wasn't the only thing that made Titane my most anticipated movie of the year, though. The trailers and reviews really didn't reveal anything at all about the plot, and I could not tell what the movie was about before watching it. And after seeing it, I can really see why. I'm going to tread very carefully in this review because I think Titane is the kind of movie that is best experienced going in completely blind and knowing nothing about it. I certainly won't be discussing any plot details, but it's honestly the kind of movie where even discussing what kind of genres it might fall into is a spoiler in and of itself. So if you're only here for my recommendation and don't want to know anything more about this movie, then I would say absolutely go and see Titane, but be prepared for it to get really, really weird weird, really violent, and really uncomfortable. And if that was enough to sell you on this movie, then I would advise clicking off the video now and just going to see it. But for the rest of you, let's get into it. I'm very happy to say that not only does Titane confirm that Raw was not a fluke, but I think it's an even better movie. Raw was a very small-scale film with one central metaphor that was explored incredibly well, but Titane is something so much more thematically and narratively ambitious. One of my biggest questions going into this film was whether it would follow suit with Raw and explore something metaphorically through a horrific circumstance, and I must say that if that's what you want out of this movie, then you will get that, but you'll also get a whole lot more. To try to describe the setup of this movie is pretty difficult without spoiling some of the earlier twists in the narrative, so I'm going to try to describe it in the vaguest way possible. It starts with a young girl and her father getting into a car crash, and she has to have a titanium plate surgically implanted into her head. And then we jump forward and see how the trauma of that event may have impacted her in adulthood. There's also another central character who's an older man dealing with his own past trauma, but to even try to describe how he's introduced into the film would spoil some very important stuff that I don't want to spoil. What I admire most about Titane is a word that I kind of can't stop using, and that's just how ambitious it is. There are so many aspects of it that could have failed so hard and been impossible to take seriously, but Julia Ducournau's commitment to the material and these really surreal, dreamlike, metaphorical aspects kind of makes it believable even when it leaves the logic of the real world in the dust. This is such a thematically and metaphorically rich movie that will lend itself to many different valid interpretations, but that's not to say that you need to form your own symbolic understanding of the movie or read a bunch of articles about what it means to have a good time and understand the narrative. It's really not all that complex from a story standpoint, and the metaphors and symbols are there to enhance the experience rather than make up the core of the experience. Everybody going to see this film is going to take something different from it. There's definitely some nods to David Cronenberg's Crash and how that film kind of explores the fetishization of women in cars and how those two things are inexplicably intertwined. There's also stuff about gender identity, how we process trauma, how we lie to ourselves. If you're like me and don't really care if a movie makes logical sense as long as it makes emotional sense, then there is quite a lot that you can get out of it. It's been a couple days since I saw it, and there's already so much that's sinking in about it thematically and what it might be trying to say and how I can relate to it in a bizarre way. I saw this less than an hour after seeing The Eyes of Tammy Faye, and I can't tell you how refreshing it was to go from something so soulless and uninspired to something that feels like such a creative vision from one individual. From a technical perspective, I can hardly fault the film. The first thing that I noticed before the opening credits had even ended was just how great the sound editing and sound mixing was, and the level of attention that was put into how this movie looks and how it visually tells its story is just so clear from watching it. The film really only relies on dialogue when it absolutely has to, and when it can let the visuals tell the audience what we need to know, it does. It's through the framing, through the performances, and through characters' reactions to things. We learn so much about the relationship the central character has with her parents without any dialogue being spoken. Without getting into detail, there are many setups in the film which mean that the lead actress, Agathe Roussel, can't talk and has to rely on her facial cues and body language to communicate emotions and ideas to the audience, and she does such a phenomenal job with it. There was a moment towards the beginning of the film in which her reaction to something happening told me a great deal about this character's past that we did not see on screen. Vincent Lindon also gives a fantastic performance and carries the emotional weight of the movie. As the narrative plays out, the complexities of his character begin to show themselves, and it makes for a genuinely heartbreaking watch. We gradually realize what he's thinking and feeling without him having to say anything, and it's just so emotionally true and very impactful. There are so many creative choices visually. There are a few scenes that are lit with this beautiful magenta light that I can picture just from memory. The music is really well composed and appropriately used. One small aspect of the score that I really appreciated was how often it uses metallic percussion. Titane means titanium in French, so it's a really nice little detail. It's never overbearing, and it always adds to the experience of the scene. There are some incredibly intense moments in this film, and the violence is shown in a way that's absolutely horrifying. The first real moment of violence in the film sets the tone by being quite shocking and very realistic, and every other violent sequence afterwards is equally as memorable and uncomfortable to watch. For context, I'm an enormous horror fan who loves stuff like Saw and Final Destination, so this kind of gory violence really doesn't usually get to me, but something about the way in which it's presented in this film is very unsettling. But with that said, Julia Ducournau never loses this blackly comic heart at the center of the film. Between these brutal acts of violence, and even often during them, there are clear attempts at situational comedy that land incredibly well. There were certainly moments where I was cringing and also laughing at the same time, and it's a pretty awesome example of blending genres flawlessly. It's also not just murder violence. Earlier I mentioned Cronenberg in relation to Crash, and while that's certainly here in this movie, so are his earlier body horror films like The Fly and Videodrome. But to say that this is inspired by Cronenberg or in any way an imitation of him is a disservice to director Julia Ducournau. It's an instance where you can so clearly tell the difference between imitation and influence. There is a lot of Cronenberg in here, but Cronenberg could never have made a movie like this. No one could have made a movie like this except for Julia Ducournau because it's such a personal expression. And that's about all I have to say about Titane. Julia Ducournau has crafted yet another top-notch genre film, and I could not love this movie more if I tried. I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since seeing it, and it is easily my favorite movie of the year so far, and my favorite movie I've seen since The Lighthouse. It's certainly not a movie I would recommend to everyone, but if it sounds like something that might interest you or that you could stomach, then please go see it as soon as possible and support this incredibly unique artistic vision. I cannot wait to see what this director does next, and it should be no surprise that I'm gonna give Titane 5 stars out of 5. And that's what I saw in the past week. I really love talking about these movies, and I'd really love to continue doing it into the future, so definitely expect more of this. But don't worry if you're more interested in music than movies, this is definitely not going to change. I am still going to be posting my original pieces on this channel, and I've got a lot of stuff in the works that I'm really excited about, so look forward to that soon, and go see Titane! Go, 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 go!